Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our Short Talks series. Today, I'm talking with Gordon Ryan, who is the owner of Prism Work Psychology. And today, we're going to talk about is working from home a panacea for well-being and productivity? So, quite a hot topic at the moment, with so many people still working from home and many keen to continue doing that into the future. So Gordon is a bit of an expert in this area, so I'm keen to talk to him today about these aspects. So first off, Gordon, can you give us a bit of an intro on you and your background, please?
Yeah, first of all, Giles, thanks very much for inviting me to do the interview. My background is I'm a chartered occupational psychologist, and I've worked in that arena for well over 20 years, and work in the arenas of organisational development, which is where this comes in, so work and well-being, and things like organisational culture, leadership development, and in the area of assessment as well.
Okay. So what are your thoughts on, I guess, how we'd approach this? Because I know we had some preliminary chats about aspects that need to be in place for people to thrive in the workplace. And could you talk us through a little bit of that, please?
Yeah, I think there's probably two parts to that. One is that there's a set of research that was done by Ivan Robertson, a professor from Manchester. And Ivan works with Carey Cooper, who's also a professor from Manchester and the president of the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development. And together they, over the years, have identified a number of consistent themes that underpin the good quality work and good quality work environments. And fundamentally, they've identified that there's three areas that need to be in place in order for organizations and individuals to thrive. And first of all, the sense of purpose that somebody has about the work that they do. So how engaged somebody becomes is fundamentally linked to, is there a sense of purpose? In some working environments, it's very easy to see high senses of purpose very readily, things like the NHS, and we've seen that very recently in terms of the COVID crisis. But also within that, it's a sense of direction. So where are we going to as an organization? A sense of optimism, a sense of hope. The second thing that I identified in there was a sense of belongingness. So belongingness is actually really interesting because it's the only emotional state that when you look at EEG brain patterns has the same pattern as pain. So a lack of belongingness can cause the same brain pattern as pain. And actually, when we look at how belongingness operates in organizations, it is a fundamental underpinning requirement for organizations to thrive and individuals to thrive within them. And then the third thing that's consistent about this is positive emotions, so a positive emotional environment. And sometimes you hear people talking about things like psychological safety in workplaces and employee voice. These are all parts of it feeling like a safe and productive and positive environment emotionally to be within. And those three things, sense of purpose and direction, organizational belongingness, and a positive emotional environment are very much the foundations of environments that people can thrive within.
So for someone working from home, in things like a sense of belongingness, I know with my own team here, when we all moved to work from home, I found that was particularly tricky, I think, to engender and foster that and maintain that. It seems to take more and more effort the longer we went on to think about everyone's individual needs and how you maintain that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think creating a sense of belongingness is really difficult, and particularly when you make a transition. So if you move from having been office-based to home-based, then how do you keep that connection? How do you keep that relationship? How do you keep those social kind of contacts? Because it can become quite transactional as we operate in an online environment. And I think you're right, it's very easily lost. And so one of the things, and this is quite interesting for organizations, I think, is that there's a piece of work done by the What Works in Wellbeing Centre. And this is a virtual centre set up by and funded by UK government. And one of the lead professors in that is a guy called Kevin Daniels at the University of East of England. And one of the things that they've identified is organisations during recessions, which might be quite important for where we might be going. If they have high levels of organisational identity amongst their workers, are 4 times more likely to thrive than if they don't.
Wow.
So the concern about, have we got a good sense of organisational identity? Do we have good organisational belongingness? It is fundamentally important. And I think it is more than simply having check-ins with people and being able to get everybody together on an online platform.
That's quite interesting. So if you've not got a strong sense of belongingness, and if you've got a high proportion of your workforce working from home going to a recession, then those figures put your business quite at risk by the sounds of things.
They do, and not only do they put the business at risk in terms of its resilience, but the general performance. This idea of high performing teams, as I know something you've talked about in previous interviews, and high performing teams, one of the important parts about that. And when you look at sports teams, one of the things that they spend a lot of time fostering is this idea of belongingness. And it's also part of inclusive leadership. So the inclusive leadership agenda, and again, another very hot topic in terms of the Black Lives Matters and those events that have been happening socially. Again, inclusive leadership, organisational belongingness are really important.
On the positive emotions aspect, the third piece you touched on, I found that quite interesting because, as with us now, when we're chatting over like a Zoom type video session, as I found with my staff, when you're trying to gauge their emotional mood and their state, it's very hard because you haven't got the other body language cues, some of the subtle aspects that you might pick up on face to face to know how they're feeling, because you've only got this square of their face to see, and they might be telling you, yeah, I'm fine, I'm okay, but you haven't got all the other cues that you would normally get to think, actually, no, there's something not quite right, to be able to dig. And then again, then the secondary bit from that is actually having a more meaningful conversation over a session like this can be quite tricky as well.
Yeah, and there, to be honest, there isn't a great deal of good quality research around the impact that these sorts of things have, and we'll maybe talk about the evidence that does exist in a while. But I think you're right. One of the things that we often pick up on when we're with people on an ongoing basis throughout the day is where they're peaking, where they're dropping, and also if there is something wrong. It's not usually we notice it straight away. It usually dawns on us as we've been with somebody over a period of time throughout the day. And so I think you're right. When people get into an online environment, it's very easy just to have such a small microcosm of behavior that you can't make those judgments. And I think the other thing that happens as well is that we adjust our behaviors because online environments require us to do that. We're stuck in one place. We're not moving around. And as you notice, an online meeting, we actually adopt a different set of behavioral protocols to how we share space and time and how we get into a conversation. And so I think you're right. There's a whole series of stuff there that maybe we just don't understand enough about currently, about how that really does impact. But I think actually there's a question here about how good is the evidence base for home working?
Okay. And then when we were chatting in the run-up to this, you mentioned as well about the 6 essential elements that need to be considered in the workplace. Could you talk us through those?
Yeah, the 6 essentials are something that came out of a systematic review of how well-being and performance affect organisations and individuals, and within that, the idea of these are quite helpful when we start to think about what is home working and when might it work and when might it not work. Because as I've alluded to, the evidence base isn't very strong around this, despite there being quite a lot of conversation about home working and quite a lot of individual research articles. But one of the things that we do know about the way organisations and individuals work is the 6 essential elements for well-being and performance. And these to some extent relate to those 3 underpinning psychological states that we talked about just before. So the first one is resources and communication. And therefore, one of the things to think about is what resources does somebody need in order to do a job well? and actually what communication is required. And I often think that with home working, there's a very easy thing of we have a platform, we have lots of technology, therefore we connect with people through the technology. But because we just have connectivity, that's not the same as having the right resources and the right communications. I think that needs more thought than simply we've got the ability to link into the organizational server, get the right files so we can therefore work at home. I think that's a common and easily made misunderstanding mistake. The second thing is about control. And so one of the things about people's work is where people have higher levels of control or ability to make decisions about how they work and where they work and the times they work and the way in which work is done, then actually that usually helps with well-being and productivity. But obviously there's only so far you can go with that, because you also need set organization, process and protocol in place that is common across people when you're actually working as teams as well. But control is an element of well-being. Would
that would be quite a plus for home working, wouldn't it? I guess if you're at home, you would, I guess, imagine you'd feel you have a much greater sense of control over your day and how you choose to execute that work.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the things that does come up reasonably consistently in research articles about home working, or teleworking as it's sometimes referred to in some of the research. And so your ability to control and structure your day around other activities, start work a little bit earlier, work a little bit later in the evenings, is all good. I think one of the things that is important to think about, though, as somebody moves into that is, how do you then keep some degree of ability to make sure that everybody is in one place at one point in time, and that even virtually, and have some protocols around that and some process around that? Because what you don't want is everyone doing just their own thing. But yeah, it's certainly an upside, and is one of the things that people report as a huge benefit of home working. But you also see it in flexi working as well, and again, the distinction between flexi working, which is just choosing some flexibility around your hours, also has some of those benefits.
Okay.
Some of the other things that come up, though, are things like the ability to balance your workload. And one of the findings about home working is it's very easy to overwork and lose that distinction between your work and your home life, because obviously you're often quite in the same environment. And so that is a challenge with home working, about balancing workload. And I think there's a role for managers in that as well, and leaders in organizations, about thinking about, so how do you know how much somebody is working? You have a much better feel for it when you see them every day, but actually you don't have so much of a feel for it. And there is part of that which is about, do we use time as a proxy for effectiveness and productivity? And that's often a mistake that people make. Lots of time and effort equals productivity, when really it doesn't. Things like job security and change. So change can actually be quite difficult to manage when you're trying to look at process change, organizational change across an organization, when you've got a very distributed workforce because of home working. So change is quite difficult to manage. And also it's to think about the needs of individuals as you move into working from home sort of way of operating. There's the general thought that actually everyone will warm to that. And actually there isn't very good research around this, but I have an inclination that some people will thrive and with certain aspects of that, and some people will find certain aspects very difficult. So very basically, people who are high in extroversion might find actually working from home more of a challenge than people who are high in introversion. People who are high in conscientiousness and so can structure their days and their work better might find it easier than people who are actually quite distractible. And then the working relationships links back to the belongingness. That's another kind of one of these 6 essentials, and the quality of those working relationships. It is very difficult to get the same quality when you're just not with people quite as much. And then finally, the job conditions. And job conditions, I think, are a really interesting area when it comes to working from home, because does somebody actually have the environment that makes for a productive working from home environment? Do they have the right sort of chair? Do they have the right sort of desk, the right sort of equipment, which is part of the resources? But just that general working environment, how easy is it for them to actually work from home? Because it's something I think we assume most people want to be able to do if they can do, but there is some sense that actually older workers, more experienced workers, actually enjoy it better than younger, less experienced workers. So there's not strong evidence around this. There's a single piece of research in one article where younger workers actually like the office environment because it's actually part of their social interactions with a wider group of people.
No, it's interesting. I thank you for that. I mean, I can share some of my insights from running a sales team here through lockdown, and things like, as you mentioned, resources and communication. Resources we didn't find were too much of a challenge because of the way we'd set up all our tools. Communication was pretty good, but the collaboration aspect was tricky, and particularly tie into driving change. So we changed probably 3 core things in the business during that last 12 weeks. And one of them was looking at one of our core business development processes. We overhauled it completely. And it was really interesting going through that process with all these faces on the Zoom sessions, talking it through, keeping them all involved. And I would have said it was a lot harder driving that than it would have been in the office, because even for me, gauging their feedback and thoughts and ideas, I think for also where the staff members would bounce off each other as well and interact. So that we did it, but that was I think exhausting from a management perspective. So that would be one concern from me from, I guess, continued work from home on a high volume basis is the loading on the management. The work relations is the other bit. Again, it's been interesting as we've come back into the office, just watching the interaction between the team members again, and even that, just the small, well, I don't know, they call it like water cooler chatter, that kind of thing, but the small aspects of each other's lives and just the background chatter that you only then appreciate, that's quite critical, and it is quite a key part to have around, even just as you're making your coffee in the morning or having that bit of a chat and finding out what's been happening. After having 12 weeks of you've got, I guess, when you're on an online session like this, you have to kind of force it a lot more again, which I found was more tiring. It wasn't a natural thing. So for me, we found that there were certain elements with the balanced workload, because we run a sprint basis. We have 3 sprints a day that we work to. So that worked perfectly for us. And we would start at 8:30. We'd have a team session. We'd have one at 2:00, and then at 5:30 we'd all clock off. So I think for the team's hours were more condensed and keeping the workload balanced. I found mine went through the roof. I was doing probably an extra 4 hours a day. So that's why I'd be interested, I guess, if you do come across research in the future on managing work from home employees and environments, to see what the research is on that.
Yeah, I think it is interesting you mentioned the research, and it's one of the things that I thought actually is worth saying something about, because when you look at is there high volumes of good quality research around what makes for good home working, the answer to that is not really. And so what I've looked at is, are there systematic reviews where the existing research is trawled and condensed to find consistent common themes, and it's the consistency of those common themes in systematic reviews that tell us something about what is likely to be generalizable and transferable to other organizational environments. And the reality is there's not. If you go into research databases and actually look for these things, there are some systematic reviews. But there's 2 things about those systematic reviews. There's quite a number of them are quite old. And then when you look into the systematic reviews, there's an awful lot of the papers that sit in those systematic reviews that, again, are a little bit older, but also that they're mainly based in the US rather than in, say, the UK context. Now, there might be no real difference, but we don't know. And so there's an awful lot of this is we don't know. So that's why I actually think taking those 6 essentials around resources and communication, control, balanced workload, job security and change, working relationships, job conditions, and thinking about things like organizational belongingness and identity, and thinking about, well, what might happen as we move into home working, to help inform that is really important. But I actually think that this hits on a key thing, which is, as an organization and as a working kind of culture, often we hear things like people say, well, we've been working from home and it's working great. You know, people have been more productive, you know, they're enjoying it more, they're more satisfied. But actually, we've been in a really unusual environment if you've been forced into working from home because of COVID. I'm not actually sure that's a terribly good metric of what working from home in a normal instance might be like. So, for instance, the ability to actually contact our customers might be much more difficult or much easier because actually people are working in a different way. But we just don't know. And I think any organization stepping into the let's go more into the working from home way of operating, I think they should do two things. One is start with what might actually help the working from home and what might we need to think about. And the second thing is get a baseline measure of where you are and take a measure of what that working from home then looks like in terms of effectiveness, productivity, and engagement and satisfaction, and then decide how much of that is a good thing. There was one thing I came across actually when I was looking at some of this. One of the things that struck me was, is there a question of, is too much of a good thing too much? And there was one bit of work that I found that suggested that actually working from home has a marginal benefit in terms of productivity. So some of the rhetoric about, oh, we get great productivity from working from home isn't maybe as people believe it to be. And I think as we repeat those mantras, we can believe in something more than the evidence suggests we should. And so I think there is a danger there. And that's why I think this idea of get your organizational metric, know what you're doing, and take a measure of how much change there's been is important. But the other thing I did come across was this idea of, could you get too much of a good thing? So working from home on a full-time basis, as many people have been doing recently, might come at a cost, it's suggested. And that cost is in two areas. One is about the social connections and the degree of organizational belongingness and identity. But the other part is actually that people may lose the opportunities for job enrichment and personal development that come from actually being with colleagues and that they might have more ready access to in the real working environment, the office environment. So I think actually there's the evidence base is an important place to start to think about what do we know, because I don't think we know what makes for highly successful working from home. We can only suggest that at the moment.
And I think the metric point you touched on is really valid because, as you say, I've got quite a few companies talking to me saying, yeah, our productivity has been great. But I would always challenge that to say, how accurately are you measuring it? How well do you know your KPIs or your measures that you're gauging on that? And frequently the answer I get back isn't that clear. So with the 6 essentials underpinning well-being, if you were an employer now looking at saying, right, well, I'm looking at my strategy for what I do with my requests for work from home going forward, is it as simple as, with those 6 elements, of almost having a sliding scale from high to low and seeing, so if I score well, I think I've got all the resources needed to do it. I think our communication channels and the tools and aspects we've got for that are good. If people feel a high level of control over their work and we're confident we can balance the workload, there's maybe not huge amounts of change we're going to be going through, and there's good work relations and the conditions are good, then that would score me highly to let them work from home. If the opposite is clear, then we would avoid work from home. Is it as simple as that, or looking at a sliding scale basis?
I think that's a good starting point, but I don't think it's as simple as that. So I'll give you an idea of why it might not be as simple as that. One of the things you mentioned yourself was your team's workload seemed to actually be reasonably manageable. And I actually like your idea of managing the day in sprints, because actually there is some evidence that actually having a structure to the day, whether it's an organizational structure or your own personal structure, actually helps when you're working from home. However, what happens when, for instance, you go through a recruitment or you go through a growth spurt as an organization, you bring in a lot of new people, They might be some more inexperienced people. There might be some of those people are highly experienced but are new to your organization. And so your organization is rarely going to stay static. And so in those instances, the needs of those individuals and therefore the needs of the business become different to what you might have as a static sort of picture. So I think it's a good starting point, but you've got to constantly keep some of that under review because there'll be so many other things changing all of the time. And the fact that you've been working so much more to make this work tells you something about the way that that would normally impact upon your middle and senior managers in an organization, because you're going to need managers to check in with their members of staff much more frequently and in a different way. It's interesting. I was doing some executive coaching for somebody in an organization during the period where there's a lot more working from home. They were working from home, their teams were working from home. And one of the things that we got into talking about was that they'd noticed that they found it so much easier not to call their team members. And they had to institute a new discipline for themselves that they would never normally need in an office environment, of checking in with their team members much more consciously and in a much more systematic way to work out, okay, so what is it you're working on? What is it you got to do today? Where is it you're taking this piece of work? Okay, how comfortable and supported do you feel with that? Is there anything you need from me? But because they would normally do that in a very probably unstructured sort of way, because they're just with them normally, they actually found that they had to start to think about that very, very consciously. And that has a consequence in time. So actually the balanced workload might work for some of your workforce, but you might actually load it somewhere else.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I struggled with it initially in the first few weeks because I found it really difficult to switch that mode of checking in with everyone without. It's a fine balance between micromanagement and feeling like you're overdoing it, but also making sure you are keeping in touch. Because I found in the office space we're in, and there's only 12 of us, I can tell if someone's walking towards my office or I see them in the corridor, I can generally tell within a second of their demeanor, the way they're walking, how fast they're walking, where they're looking, whether there's a problem brewing or whether they're happy and they're on top of it. And I guess I hadn't really thought about how much during the day I'd take those visual cues from seeing individuals around the office to know, well, look okay, or actually there's something there we probably need to have a chat about. And the way I'll set up is everyone walks past my door when they're going out of the main workspace, say to the kitchen to get a brew. And we'll get it frequently during the day. If someone's got a challenge, they'll normally just stop and lean in the door and say, hey, what do you think about this? And then equally, they'll come to me with good news. And one of the aspects I found probably the hardest was celebrating good news. It's just not the same when you're doing it over an online session, just clapping away in the background or whatever. It was really tricky to just get that excitement and sharing that joy about some of the deals we were doing. So it's been really fascinating with this. I think the one bit I just wanted to hopefully close off on was the sense of belongingness, because that's a really interesting one for employers to think about. How engaged are my employees? How much do they feel? How do you measure that? How would, if you're an employer looking at that and thinking, well, yeah, I've got my individuals are pretty bought in and they like working here and we do fun stuff. How would you gauge that? How would you begin to gauge that?
Well, I suppose one of the things actually is to just reflect on one of the things you just mentioned, and I will answer your question, is one of the ways we are often online trying to work out if everything's okay is we ask people, so how is it going? And the answer you will get back is fine. And it becomes a social trade, which is you ask me the question I expect to be asked, I give you the answer that I know you expect to get, but you don't get anything further. So I think this thing about just how much cues we use about if somebody is genuinely fine or not is really important. So on your question, I think with this, one of the things is that there's plenty of ways you can measure employee engagement and employee well-being and satisfaction. And so that has been one of the things that many organizations have done for quite a long time. And I think that is something that organisations should continue to do, particularly if you are then going through a change of operating or the change of balance. So, it might not be working from home all the time. It might be working from home 2 or 3 days a week. Because again, this idea of is too much of a good thing too much? And so I think you should start to take those measures. But I think one of the most productive ways to do that is not so much the annual organisational survey. I actually think that is quite staid and stale now. So very much more using very short questions, different questions at different times, focused on different elements of well-being and engagement, and using that in a way which actually you send out on a monthly basis. So you focus on different things. I think, though, there is no substitute in all of this for creating a culture where there's psychological safety, where somebody can actually feel like, if there is an issue, it will be a welcomed conversation and not a challenged conversation. So one of the other areas that I do some amount of work with is this idea of organisational cultures where there isn't an organisational culture of learning from mistakes, psychological safety. And I know we all say, there's no blame here, but then when it goes wrong, it's very easy to blame. So it is around that, creating employee voice, because again, employee voice and the ability to raise issues, have conversations, have discussions is really important. And so things like monthly meetings or weekly meetings, where part of that is, I want to explore the question of, are we actually happy at work? What is working, what's not working? Creating that channel of feedback is probably more important than just a surveying.
No, it's fantastic. No, that's great. I don't think I've got any more questions. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
I think it is just to say that actually, working from home probably isn't a panacea. There probably is a point at which you can have too much of a good thing. There is some suggestion also that actually when you start working from home, there's no longitudinal studies of working from home. So when you start it, there might be a flurry of enthusiasm and effort. But we don't know really what happens as that dies off. And then I think one of the things to be very careful and guarded against is there's studies like the Nicholas Bloom study that was published in 2015, where they found in an organization called C-Trip, this great improvement. There's nearly 14% improvement in productivity. But actually, when you look at the broader research, the suggestion is that if there's benefits, they're probably marginal. But that doesn't mean they're not worth doing. It's do it consciously, and actually take some measure of where you were and where you actually are, so you don't get into that point that you raised, which is we believe it's more healthy, we believe it's more productive, as opposed to actually we know it's more healthy, we know it's more productive.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gordon. I really appreciate your time today. It's been fascinating talking to you. Thanks again, and all the best.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and thanks for inviting me to do it.
Thanks.